Hi, everybody. This is David Manks with SailPoint, and I'm excited to be here today at Octane 20 talking about the future of identity using the power of artificial intelligence and machine learning. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I want to start by talking about a situation that organizations are dealing with every single day. Now, I know you're saying, digital transformation. We hear about that all the time. It's such a buzzword, but it's just so important. I'm sure just about every single one of you has a digital transformation initiative in some form or fashion. So really and the reason is because it's so significant today. There's a $2 trillion spend on digital transformation every single year, growing at a 40% rate, which is just amazing. And it represents almost 50% of an organization's IT budget. So clearly it's very significant. And there's so many benefits to it, right? There's agility and greater efficiency, more competitiveness, ability to connect better with your customers, employees, and partners. But in addition to all these great things, there is more risk. And I'll tell you, the bad guys love digital transformation. Just the whole expansive nature of digital transformation opens an organization to potential threats and risks in so many different ways. And we're going to explore a couple of those. So to start with, it's about more users. Right. That, of course, represents a number of challenges for organizations as all of these different types of users are connecting to the network environment and getting access to all the different applications and data sources. So it's not just employees any longer. You've got contractors, suppliers, which, by the way, one of the largest retail data breaches of all time was because of a third-party contractor and supplier that was gaining access to the corporate network. They were breached, and then the organization was breached. So I've got all of these different types of users spread out in so many different locations. But now I also have non-human users as well, right? RPAs or bots, IoT devices. It's amazing how many organizations I speak to on an ongoing basis that are running bots in their organization that don't have any governance or control associated with them. A lot of times, organizations don't even know if they're running because lots of groups have deployed them. And these bots have access to so many systems, just like their human counterparts, right? They're gaining access to various databases for search inquiries, gaining access to service data, to lots of different types of potential confidential information. And that is a potential breach as well. So lots of different types of users and lots of apps, right? And that's growing at just such an astronomical percentage. As a matter of fact, there's a 1,200% increase in cloud application usage. I saw one study that said an enterprise organization can have up to 1,000 different applications. And I always ask when I'm talking to organizations, are you aware of how many applications you have? And are you aware of who has access to those applications? And most of the time, they're shaking their head no. But that's not uncommon, right? Because you've got all these different organizations and departments that are trying to do their own thing. Not everything goes through IT, thus the shadow IT that takes place. So what's happening is there's layer and layer of applications taking place. I like to refer to it as the application archaeological dig. And what I mean by that is that as new applications come on board, they're not necessarily replacing the old application. They're just additive. So I've got this growing amount of applications taking place. And then the question becomes, well, so you're growing all these applications. What's happening to the users that were on all these applications? Are you controlling that each step along the way? Now, in addition to these cloud applications, I've got my on-prem applications. I've got hybrid environments, potentially mainframe environments as well that are still quite prevalent for larger enterprise organizations. Now I have cloud infrastructure taking place as well, right? You've got AWS and Azure and Google Cloud. Many of you are probably deploying some of those, if not all of those. I continually hear about organizations that have a multi-cloud approach. So now what happens is that an organization is deploying this cloud infrastructure, and you've got to define who's gaining access to that, being able to control and govern that access in addition to all your other applications. I mean, it's basically an entire network unto itself. Ask anybody in DevOps that's managing those environments. And then lastly, more data, right? We know that the digital data is growing exponentially. But in addition to that, and all the other applications that I have data sources, like it could be SAP or Oracle or healthcare records, like through Epic, for example. But what's happening is a lot of users are pulling down this data. So I'm sure you've all done it, right? You've run a report, an Excel file, or you've got to give a corporate presentation based upon some specific data. So you're pulling reports down and putting them into PowerPoint presentations or Word docs or Excel. And then what do? We email them out. We put them out on Box or Dropbox or SharePoint or OneDrive. I don't know about you, but I probably have 4 or 5 different cloud resource systems out there, and I'm not sure, what's out on each of them. So now organizations that have, whether it's corporate ones or each individual user have their own private ones, this data is getting disseminated across, and it's basically being scattered to the winds. And that's what we call unstructured data. And with this unstructured data, are you aware of this data that's out there? Is there a potential that it is confidential or privacy-based information? And that's really critical, because if you don't know that, then that's a potential security blind spot and gap. So why is this all important? Well, we all know that data breaches are the new norm. I don't think there's a morning that we don't wake up and read about a new data breach that takes place. In 2018, there were 5 billion data records that were exposed, a huge number. I believe it came out to about 18 per day, I think I calculated. Now, this is 2018. You might be asking, well, what about 2019? And I've looked this up, and I don't have the full 2019 data point yet. But I did see that the first half of 2019 were 4 billion data records that were exposed. So I'm expecting that it probably doubled 2018, about 10 billion data records. Plus, some of the largest breaches had taken place last year in terms of numbers of exposed data records. So really the question is, how do we stay ahead of this security curve, right? How do we address it and really get ahead of these very advanced security threats and risks that are taking place, right? They're getting more and more advanced. There's individuals and organizations dedicated to just focusing on getting this data and getting access to this. So how do we address this, right? We've been talking about this more and more of more data, more users, more applications. So it's more difficult than ever before to be able to stay ahead of the security curve. And one of the ways to address that is through identity governance. And that's really what SailPoint's all about. So to help easily understand what identity governance is, which we talk about as being the linchpin or the connective tissue between this apps, data, and applications that we've been talking about. So really a good way to think about it is identity governance is really about answering these 3 questions. Who currently has access? Who should have access? And how is that access being used? Right? That's a good way to think about what identity governance is. And the last 2, who should have access and how is that access being used, is really the desired state, right? Being able to have that level of granular control. So I'll ask you, are you able to answer those questions? It's something important that you need to think about as you go back to your daily work and be able to answer those questions. Now, one of the questions I get asked quite frequently is, what is the difference between Okta Access Management and SailPoint Identity Governance? So what I'm going to show is just a really good way to explain the difference and the value of the combined solution. So Okta is great about providing secure access, single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, enabling that secure access to all your applications. And then what identity governance does, in addition to that, is it's going to provide that granular level of control around what you can do once you're gaining access. I like to think about it like access management is the doorman that's going to say who can come in and who not within the building. And then identity governance that says what you can do once you're in, which room you're allowed to go into, and what you can do within each of those rooms. So in this example, the sales representative has access to a number of mission critical applications, Salesforce being one of them, of course, a great example. And then you can see how granular we get with that access. So they're specifically in America, so they're only able to access that regional information. They're only able to access the West, which is the region that they're in, and only allowed to see closed deal information. For example, they may not be able to see pipeline data. Or maybe their commission information, they can only view their commission. They can't calculate or cut a commission check, as an example. That's something that we call separation or segregation of duties. A great example of that might be a person that's in accounts payable and accounts receivable. I'm going to make sure that there's not this toxic combination where they're able to cut themselves a check and receive that check as well, right? That's where fraud comes in. So I can get real granular with the control of access and what those users can do. So that's a great example of how we, both the combination of SailPoint and Okta, work together. And here's a great representation showing the value of the combined solution. We talk about Okta being able to connect everything and SailPoint being able to govern everything. So a couple of really great use cases. As users need access to new applications, they can, through Okta, do an access request for a new application. That workflow takes place. The application is granted, is populated through the Okta portal, and the user has access to that application immediately in a very process-oriented approach. Same thing with a certification, for example. Maybe your organization needs to certify who has access to a specific application. Through the Okta portal, I can run a certification campaign directly through SailPoint. Some really good examples of how we work together. Ultimately, it's two sides of the same value coin, so to speak. And really, when the two are integrated, the combination of the solution really provide these key benefits. The ability to automate and unify access, having that centralized view for all of your users to be able to see what they can access and what the new applications that they might want to be able to request as well, all from a central view. Of course, being able to improve security and reduce risk for all the reasons that we spoke about before. The combination is great for providing that. And the ability to enforce and demonstrate compliance and be able to prove that access for regulations into your auditors. All right, so now let's shift a little bit and let's talk about the future of identity, right? Why is this important? Well, number one, to be able to address all these challenges that we've been talking about, number one, but also to be proactive, right? Proactive, or what we call predictive, right? Because if you're reactive, then the potential breach has already happened, right? And we can't let that take place. So we've got to be proactive. We've got to be ahead of the curve. We've got to be predictive in the way that we approach this moving forward. With all of the identity data that we are dealing with today, right? All of the information, the more and more that we've been talking about, there's just no possible way for humans to be able to handle all that. Right? And I have to constantly be throwing more and more resources to be able to address that. So there's no way that a human can be able to look at all that data, be able to interoperate, make that data actionable, being able to address that and make sense of it, because there's just so much information. I kind of think about it like a security event. They've got all this data taking place, all this information coming to me, but how do I know what to do with it? So that's really what predictive identity is about. And a great way to think about predictive identity is by thinking about the human body and the central nervous system, right? So the central nervous system is great at continually monitoring, protecting, identifying potential threats that are taking place, and reacting to that. Right, that's what your body does, and that's what the central nervous system is doing. So it's always protecting you. A great example might be maybe fire, for example, and you're getting too close to it. Right, your natural reaction is to come away with it, to come away from it. So predictive identity works in very much that same way. It's going to provide you the intelligence, information, and insight so that you could react to that information and make the appropriate decisions. The other thing that predictive identity provides is transparency. And what I mean by that is that it's just like air. Identity needs to be always available. I shouldn't have to think about it, right? Just like taking a breath. I shouldn't have to think about that. And information needs to always be available for me to be able to make these decisions. So an example might be your board needs to see information on access reports, or being able to be in compliance for a specific regulation, or GDPR or HIPAA. I don't want to have to spend a lot of time thinking about getting that information, identifying resources to pull that information, thinking about, how am I going to pull that information, having it take weeks or months to be able to pull that. So I've got to be able to have that information immediately available at my fingertips and be able to be responsive and pull that information and be transparent about it. And it's also important that it's available across the organization. To the security teams, to the IT teams, and to the users as well, to the administrators that are granting that access or certifying that application. And remember, this is all driven by artificial intelligence and machine learning. I am seeing such huge growth in this area. Just about every partner that we work with or application that I see are leveraging some form, fashion of AI, right? So we're seeing huge growth amounts here. 87% of organizations have at least one transaction or application using AI. It's a 40% growth year over year, $26 billion spend by 2023 on artificial intelligence. So really, we're seeing a lot of adoption taking place with AI. So organizations are becoming familiar with that and comfortable with it, which is really important. Because when we talk about the power of identity, we're again talking about leveraging and using the power of AI and machine learning. But it's really beyond just basic analytics, right? Because it's ultimately about understanding, learning, and adapting to your organization and how your organization runs, using that information to help provide intelligence and more insightful data. All right, so let's talk about what the power of predictive identity can do for you. So to start off with, it can help anticipate user access needs. So when a user comes on board, they're provided with their birthrights, all their different applications that they have access to, right? That's something that SailPoint helped provide from a life cycle management. But what happens if a new application is needed? Maybe there's a new project that the user is on, so that they've got to have access to this new application. Maybe they're on a new project team. So what happens is they've got to do a request for a new application. Maybe you've got to go through a help desk ticket. And then that application, that help desk ticket has to be then disseminated to the application owner. That application owner has to provision that application. And that could take days. And ultimately that means that that user is unproductive, right? As they're waiting for that. And we don't clearly want that user needs to get started right away to be able to do their job. So with the power of identity, I can anticipate user access needs before they even need to request that application based upon their specific profile or their role or the department. So it can see other users like that and make a recommendation that application access is granted to that individual. And really that's looking at things like their peer groups and users that are similar to them. So it's making that recommendation. A great way to think about this is Netflix or Spotify or Amazon. So when you make these purchases, what does it do? It says, people that have purchased this have also purchased these items as well. So it makes that recommendation based upon AI of other individuals. So you can think about providing application access in that same way. All right, so next, moving on, is spotting risky behaviors. And that's really important. That goes back to that proactive versus reactive approach, right? Because if we're reactive, the breach has already happened. So we've got to be able to spot these risky behaviors as they're taking place and be actionable about it. So let me give you an example here. Maybe there's an individual that's in finance, and they're gaining access to specific data sources, maybe financial or critical data sources, multiple evenings in a row. So what do I want to do with that data? I can be very specific and actionable with that. Or I could just report on it. So maybe what I can do is I can send a message to a security manager and notify them that this is taking place, and they can research that. I can send a certification request to that individual's manager or that application owner, validating and verifying that this user has access to this application and they should be accessing this application. Or maybe I want to be real specific and I want to be actionable. I can send a notification to a manager asking them to certify that application. And if they say, well, you know what, I don't know if they should be, they can actually deprovision that application right then and there. And now that application access is revoked. And maybe you can do it at the time until you can verify, hey, was this individual, truly accessing the application based upon specific requirement and need, and validating that information. Adapting and automating security policies. Developing security policies is extremely difficult for organizations, regardless of the size. So whether you're a 1,000 employee organization or 100,000 employee organization, being able to develop these policies is extremely challenging, because I've got to be able to identify who within the organization has the appropriate access based upon just so many other factors. Some of the things we've been talking about, like their role, their department, their group. It's extremely challenging and takes a lot of resources and can take months for organizations to implement that. So now if I can automate that process, right? What if I could have a new application available and be able to have AI running in the background, being able to identify specific security policies, the appropriate groups and individuals that should be accessing that application based upon the other applications, the peer groups analysis that we've identified, and then be able to have that policy set for downstream effect. Right, that automates the process, or makes it much more efficient, and puts you in a continuous state of role management and role modeling. And then lastly, it allows you to stay in complete control. One of the questions that I get asked so often with respect to predictive identity and AI machine learning is, is that going to put me in an out of control situation where it's going to be just making these changes, is just going to be implementing these access requests or certifications and such? And that's not so. It's actually putting you more in control than ever before, because what it's doing is it's using this intelligence, this insightful information, and making the recommendation to you. So you stay in complete control, but you got context now. You can make decisions with this information. So before we talked about the significant amount of identity data that you can't make decisions from because there's just so much information. How do you make sense of all of this? So by providing insight, intelligence, and recommendations, it allows you to stay in complete control and puts the power back in your hands. Ultimately, it's about making identity easier, right? Because it shouldn't be hard. There's too many other things that you're all dealing with on an ongoing basis, right? All the digital transformation challenges that we spoke about, everything that's going on with your IT systems that you're having to manage on an ongoing basis. As we said, identity needs to be predictive and proactive rather than reactive. It's got to be able to put you in control. And it's got to be easy across the entire organization, right? It's got to be for your security management team, for your IT team, for your analysts, and most importantly, for your users. I spoke to so many organizations, so many customers of ours that have said that it's got to be easy for the users, because if I've got to train the users and the users aren't adopting the technology, then it'll fail. It'll never take place. And that's one of the great benefits of the predictive identity and SailPoint solutions is it's easy for the users to adapt and to be able to implement and manage. All right, so now let's drill down and talk some of the additional benefits of predictive identity and the power that it provides to you. So we're going to talk about predictive modeling, autonomous identity, adaptive security, and continuous compliance. Predictive modeling, and we talked about this a little bit before, is really the ability to create logical groupings for access models and policies. As we said, that creating these policies, these security policies, is very difficult. Right? I've got so many different layers of roles within the organization. Sales, for example, as a category, right? I've got not just sales, I've got sales management, I've got outside sales, inside sales, sales operations, sales across the various regions, that in that example that we spoke about before with access to Salesforce. So with predictive modeling, what we do is we allow you to see logical, visual-based groupings. So what I can do is I can see groupings for individual access and see if that's appropriate. And then what it allows me to do is to visualize if there are specific outliers, and then be able to click into that and see why are they outliers. And then what I can do is if I see that they're outliers and it's not appropriate, I can pull them in under the current governance program and in the correct grouping. So this way, I'm always able to have the program current, whether you are in a new identity program that you're just developing. It allows you to identify the appropriate security policies and groupings from a recommendation standpoint moving forward. Or if you have an existing identity program, it'll look at what you currently have and then make the appropriate recommendations on ways to improve and to advance that. It also allows you to add new applications and keep them under current policies. I mean, your organization is always changing, right? You've got departments moving from one to the other, reorgs taking place. You've got mergers and acquisitions, and all of these things affect the access across the organization. So by using this predictive modeling, I can always be monitoring, bringing these users under the appropriate policies and under your corporate guidelines, and always in control. Autonomous identity is really exciting. Autonomous identity, we talked about this a little bit before, being able to automate these low-risk tasks, such as providing users access to applications. Right? Every time a new user wants an application, as I said before, it's a very manual process. It requires a help desk ticket or some specific provisioning across the application owner. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources. It's potentially unproductive for the user. So what if I can automate that whole process and ultimately improve the speed and the delivery of that, taking that from days potentially to hours? A great example of this is in the SailPoint marketing organization. We had a new really cool marketing analytics tool that allowed us to do some very specific targeting. And we were implementing this new application. And of course, our marketing operations teams were the first ones to start implementing and using it. And then as we started to roll it out, broadly across the marketing organization, starting with our CMO and then to the marketing management team. So by having the AI engine continually monitoring this information, instead of having to continually do requests for every other marketing user, back to that example before of the Amazon or Spotify, it would learn from that and then said, okay, David's in marketing, so I can see all of his other peers are in marketing too. So I'm going to make the recommendation in advance and say, David should have access to this application based upon his associated peers and equivalent rights to those other users. So it would then send a request to that application owner, my manager, however you have the workflow set up. They would simply approve it, and now I have access to that. Or you can even automate that process if you wanted to as well, depending upon the criticality of that application. So this improves the delivery and speed of the application. And then moving forward allows you to discover new access and bring it under control. An example might be where I have a new application and I don't necessarily know which users are gaining access to it. So now I can bring that under governance and control as well. Adaptive security is really exciting. This goes back to the example we spoke about before of being proactive, being able to detect and address risky behavior. We spoke about that at finance example before. So a couple of things here. Number one, it allows me to do what we call a micro certification. So in the example I spoke about, we've identified a risky behavior, that individual in finance. So we're going to do a certification, which many times organizations do on a monthly or a quarterly or maybe even every 6 months, because it's such an arduous process, right? It takes a lot of time. A lot of times, maybe you're doing it on spreadsheets. I can't tell you how many organizations I've spoke to that are doing this on a manual spreadsheet basis. So what I can do is if I need to identify if the access is appropriate, I can do a micro certification for an individual, send the notification to a manager and say, is this access appropriate? They can approve it or decline it right then and there. If they decline it, it deprovisions that access. And then when I approve it, now I've got an audit trail. I've got the ability to report that information out from a compliance standpoint for regulation compliance or for my auditors. So it allows me to do this on an ongoing basis versus if I identified a risky behavior, I don't have to wait for the next certification to take place 3 or 6 months later. I can do it right now. Another thing that I can do is I can provide smarter information and be able to make more intelligent decisions, what we call AI recommendations. And what I mean by that is, let's say in this scenario of the risky user with finance, I'm going to send a certification over to their manager. And not only is it going to say, hey, should this user have access, but it's going to give them very specific guidance. It's going to give them a thumbs up or a thumbs down for a recommendation to provide this access or certification based upon a peer group analysis. So what it'll say is it'll give you a green thumbs up and say 90% of other individuals, just like this individual, are also accessing this application. So there's no guesswork. I can approve it right then and there based upon the data, the insightfulness that it just provided me. So I don't have to say, you know what, I don't know whether I should provide this person access. And then the manager has to then go and do a whole bunch of research or verify the information in some form or fashion. Or maybe a worse scenario is that they're actually just approving it, right? They're rubber stamping the approval without even thinking about it. It's like, hey, John made the request. He's a good guy. He's a good employee. I'm just going to approve it without having to think about it. Or we've even seen where in a certification scenario, they're just clicking approve, 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 right? They're rubber stamping all the users. Of course, now there's no true management or guidelines there. And ultimately what this does is it puts you in a continuous state of compliance, right? And I think about it this way, that compliance shouldn't be an activity. It shouldn't be an activity at a certain point in time. It should be a state that you're always having information available at your fingertips. Back to that transparency that we spoke about before. And what that does is that minimizes the time and effort and resources It identifies compliance gaps and threats, and it has you always being audit ready, instantly available at your fingertips to provide that information, that reporting, and that audit trail. So if your board asks you or to comply to a specific regulation like PCI or HIPAA, you have that information always available and at your fingertips. So we've been talking a lot about how identity is critical to security. Identity is that linchpin and really the connective tissue across all these areas. That's why we talk about putting identity at the center of your organization's IT and security infrastructure. It talks to and connects to all these other systems, getting information and sharing information back and forth, all from a central point. So as you go back and after this Octane event's over, and you go back and you assess, all the things that you've learned and what are the things that you can do moving forward, take a look at these things to consider and ask yourself, are you able to answer yes to these questions, right? Do you have complete visibility into potential risky users? If there was a risky user in the scenario that we spoke about, would you know that? Would you get that information? Do you have, or are you moving to a multi-cloud environment? Are you deploying AWS and Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, or all of them potentially? And do you have the governance and control on that? Do you know who's accessing that data and implementing those systems? How long does it take you to implement and perform a certification campaign? What's that costing you as an organization in terms of time and individuals and from a resource standpoint? Is it taking you weeks or months to do? Are you doing it in a manual spreadsheet? Are you confident that your users are making the smart access decisions, right? Back to that rubber stamping for certifying or approving access requests. Right? What about when somebody leaves the organization? Do you have the ability from a lifecycle management to deprovision all that access? Can't tell you how many people I speak to that say, when somebody leaves the organization, I think we got all the applications that they had access to, but I'm not exactly sure. Well, that's a real challenge. That's a real security gap. And how long does it take you to generate reports to truly be in compliance? So I'd like to thank you for your time today. I hope you found this information valuable. So to learn more about SailPoint, I encourage you to come to the SailPoint virtual booth. We've got lots of great information there that talk about the value of the combined Okta and SailPoint solution. We've got lots of content there that you can download, brochures. There's some really great videos that you can take a look at, some solution videos and great demo videos that show some of the things that we've been talking about here. And ultimately, it's about having identity help you to transform your security strategy now and in the future. Thank you for your time.